All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to talk about how to improve your legal intake and get better cases. And intake is a topic that I think is so near and dear to me, just because I think having quality intake and having a quality system in place is really what separates the men from the boys in the legal industry, or the women from the girls, right? We won't discriminate. But intake is so important, and there's we talk so often about marketing and so much of those components when it comes to advertising your law firm. But you can drive a ton of leads and you can drive a ton of traffic, but if you can't actually convert those leads, and if the phones aren't being answered properly, and if there's not a good system in place to actually handle those inbound leads, then it's just going to be a ton of wasted opportunity, and as a result, wasted resources with time, money, and so on. So I've got Denny Newberry, Denny with an E, from Captorra, that's with us today. And I'm actually really excited to have Denny because not only is Denny the director of sales and a partner at Captorra, which does actually an intake software, but he has a tremendous amount of experience with intake overall. I promise you guys this will not be a sales pitch for Captorra. We actually had a bunch of questions submitted just regarding intakes. So Denny, I didn't run these by you before, but I'm going to ask you all this stuff, and I hope nothing is off limits in terms of how to best leverage and optimize intake for law firms. And then if you guys have any questions along the way, just feel free to submit them in the chat, and we'll go ahead and ask Denny as well. So Denny, give us a bit of a background on you.
Yeah, no, Michael, I certainly will. I'm excited and definitely appreciate Chris, inviting me to do this. And intake has been my life for the last 5 years, not just software, but just intake in general. I think a lot of times when firms contact our company, they're looking for help just with their intake process and how best to implement that more as much as they are just a software application. So that's certainly been my focus for a while now. And before Captorra, just if anybody's curious, and I think it does help to understand this, I spent 7 years with a case management company, which is important to know because a lot of times, and this is what we'll talk about a little bit today, when people are looking for improvement in intake or looking at a software application specifically, a lot of times they'll use that word. I need a case management system to better handle intake, and not that you can't do that. And again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But my time there gave me a lot of insight into the evolution of marketing for law firms and just how competitive this marketplace has gotten, and the mindset that consumers have when not only purchasing a product but looking for a service. And legal is not excluded from that. And just how on top of your game you need to be able to capitalize on that. And when I was with the case management side and more on the litigation and the practice management, I noticed there was this huge hole, not just from a software aspect, but just the way firms look at intake, the way they look at way leads come to them, the way they evaluate how to qualify those leads. And that was a big hole. So we felt there was a need. My business partners and I felt there was a need for that. And again, I'm really excited about this and appreciate the invite, Michael.
Yeah, well, it's our pleasure. So I guess before we get ahead of ourselves, like, how would you define intake? Like, what is intake?
Yeah, so intake just very, very simply is the qualification of a potential client for your firm to make a decision on whether or not you want to retain them as a client, and then the process of going about doing that. Now, firms within different practice areas handle that differently, but just at a very high level, the process of all the way through marketing for a client, retaining that lead, whether that be through social media, phone, however, qualifying it to be a case that you actually want, and then the process of signing that client would be kind of the A to Z of intake, the way I would define it.
Okay, and I guess the next question is, every firm, I'm sure to a degree, handles intake a little bit differently. Some have a more formalized process. Some use case management software, others do not. Some use spreadsheets. Some write down post-it notes. But what would you say? I mean, just in the things that you've seen, I guess just are there different solutions for different size firms? So like a solo attorney versus some of the much larger size firms.
I think from a solution standpoint, if we're just talking about applications, sure, there's different systems out there. I mean, an Excel sheet could be perfectly fine for a firm who doesn't have a lot of volume per se. I think the bigger piece to discuss is that doesn't mean that the process and the way that you look at intake and the way you think about intake and how important it is to your firm needs to be different. How you go about utilizing some type of solution to manage that could potentially be different based on your needs. But one of the things I hear a lot from smaller groups, for example, is, intake is just not something, and they don't necessarily say it's not as important, but what I end up hearing is it's not as important because they'll look at the different ways that a larger firm with a big call center might handle intake. and they'll name a firm by name. So I'm not that firm, so I don't really have as big of a need to have a specific application or to have as aggressive follow-up or tracking the metrics associated with where my marketing is coming from, because I just don't get that many cases or that many potential cases. And I personally think it should be the opposite. If you're a big firm and you have 50, 100 intakes in daily, weekly, what have you, a couple slip through the crack and you're surviving. You're not missing out on cases you might really need to really thrive in your business. I think for smaller groups, it's more critical to really have a good process in place and good staff, and even essentially a good solution in place to be able to capitalize on every case, because that one potential case may be that case. Everybody wants that case, and that may be it. So I think anytime you're dropping the ball in any aspect of the process is a big detriment to your firm, especially if you're a smaller practice. I think it needs to be a heavy focus for you.
All right. Well, Denny, I've got a series of questions that people have submitted, but before we get to that, I guess, what kind of impact have you seen having a formalized intake process in place, really dialing things in, optimizing things? Like, what kind of impact have you seen that make on a law firm?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and this is where, Michael, I hope I don't upset you here because of what you guys do, and I think it's extremely needed and valuable. But I will say that a lot of firms continue to put more and more money into marketing. They say, okay, I want to grow my business. So the first thing they think of is, I need a market here. I need to call Michael at Chris. We need to put together an amazing video, do a social media package. And I think all that's important. But what I see a lot of times is firms will call us and say, hey, we need to do something yesterday. And the reason they say that is because they opened up the funnel too early. They weren't really prepared. They didn't have the right staff in place, the right process. And I think it's an area, just strictly from a cost standpoint for a law firm, it's an area that not enough firms look at to improve, that doesn't really cost any money. It's just more of a focus on your own practice, looking at it as your own personal investment, and your intake is your sales staff. Law firms are no different than other industries. That's your sales department. That's the perception that a potential client has for your firm. Whether you as the attorney are taking the call for intake, or a paralegal, or you have a dedicated intake staff, that mindset just has to be different when following up with a claimant or going through an intake than if you were talking to them after you sign them up. It just needs to have a different aspect to the call. So I think that's, intake is a big part of an area that firms can look at to improve without really having to spend extra money. And then once you have that in place, then you can look to go open up the funnel and really, have those leads coming in, because until then it just may be a waste, if you're letting things fall through the crack. So that's one thing I want to talk about today. Michael, I didn't want to derail your flow of question or anything, but one of the biggest things I see is kind of the walls during the intake process, I call them. So we were talking about what is intake earlier. So if we get more defined with that, you have the origination of the call coming in, whether that's through your website, through a landing page on Facebook, through a direct phone call advertising. You have chat service, your after-hours call service takes the call. Nowadays there's multiple ways that you as a law firm can receive the initial information of that claimant. And one of the biggest aspects of where I see firms kind of fail at intake is that very initial part of it. And if it's coming in through electronically, there has to be outbound, follow-up that needs to be made. So someone contacts you through your website. We'll use that as an example. And I think this is one of the questions you guys may have asked during the registration process, Michael. And I'm always intrigued by this answer from firms on how quickly and how often they follow up with electronic leads. So whether it's website chat, third-party lead vendors, I've been inside of 200 consumer-focused practices now, looking at intake, and it's not only a wide aspect of how they handle it, but also how that answer comes in versus what is actually going on. So I think that's an important factor to really know and understand how your firm is handling that outbound follow-up. And what I see mostly as the biggest pitfall is the initial call out. I don't think in general that firms are treating those initial electronic leads with enough urgency to make that initial call. I think it was Velocify who did a research report a couple of years ago that I was looking at, and they said that after, and this is industry wide, but after 5 minutes, when someone contacts you through your website, if you haven't called them within the first 5 minutes, your conversion for contact and conversion for case drops by 72% was the number they reached out of hundreds and thousands of different groups. So that urgency just has to be there. And then also
5 minutes. How about
5 minutes?
So I read that study, and I love it. Actually, I love referencing it because it applies for actually drifted a study like that too on live chat. But so that was the 5 minute mark, right? Would you care to share what
Yeah.
happens in an hour and 24 hours?
Yeah, it's I think it was, they went all the way to 15 minutes and an hour. I think in general a lot of firms even will wait kind of within 24 hours is their goal. But at that point, it's just a drastic decline. I mean, it's a snowball effect for sure. And I think the one of the dangers for firms nowadays that I see is the assumption effect. It's assuming that because a claimant has contacted you through your website that they want your services and your services only. And I think a lot of firms won't admit that, but in the back of their mind, that's what they're thinking. They say, oh, I can get to this whenever I need to, even if it's at 7 p.m. at night. Well, if that person contacted you at 7 p.m. at night, that's when they're thinking about the fact that they want to pursue a case. And that's when they want to talk about it. And it's important to have processes in place to be able to handle that. If you don't have resources internally to make that call at 7 p.m. tonight, find someone who can, who at least can get a hold of that client to let them know, hey, we as a law firm have gotten your information. This is important to us to talk with you about. Let's schedule a time. So in the very least, that needs to be jumped on within 5 minutes. And then the second piece of that is the number of attempts. So something we haven't talked about yet, but I do think for this frame of the subject, Michael, is the sister company that we have is ICE. And the only reason I bring it up is because it is a intake call center. So not only on the software side, but the actual intake process, we live and breathe it every day. We see it work and how it doesn't work. And one of the things that we see when firms will send us over what they call stale leads is we just signed up one yesterday, actually, or day before yesterday, the 43rd attempt that we made to get a hold of this person. It was a mass tort case. They were qualified, and the firm was excited. Now that's a pretty extreme example. I think commonly the way that we see it is 7 attempts should be your minimum. 7 attempts is where just kind of consumer wide is where your conversion for contact starts to plateau. So after you get to 7, it goes all the way up to a little over 90% for your conversion. It starts to get to like 90, hovers around the low 90. So I think your best practice goal should be at least 7. We have a lot of clients that make 10, 14, and you can change it based on the value of the case. But if you're not making 7 attempts to reach out to a person who has expressed interest in your service, it doesn't mean that they're not a serious client or that they don't really want your services any longer. They're busy. If you're in the personal injury space, these people have a lot going on. They've been in an accident, and at the time they thought to call you, but 10 minutes later, they got a call from a doctor or from a family member, or, they have to handle, certain things. So it doesn't mean that on the 5th or 6th, 7th attempt that they're not just as good of a client or just as serious about their case. So that's kind of just, standard. Within 5 minutes, that first attempt should be made. And before you give up, you should make 7 attempts on that potential client.
All right, Denny. So I'm sure a lot of people are thinking that 7 attempts, that's nice. Within 5 minutes, that's great. But when am I going to follow up with all these leads 7 times and 12 times, and they've got a practice to run? You know what I mean?
Right.
And also having that level of responsiveness to be able to respond within 5 minutes, right? And I would say that this could be mostly the solos and small firms, but it could also apply to larger firms. But what would be the solution to that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It comes up all the time, and when firms are being realistic about their ability to handle things, it's when we kind of really have that conversation, and that's a good thing. That's when the dedicated staff comes into play, and it doesn't have to be a dedicated person that is on the phone every day, all day. If your phone's not ringing off the hook, I get it. You don't have the overhead to support an intake staff, so to speak. But I also think that a lot of times we're talking to attorneys, and I don't disagree with them, but their comment to me is like, well, nobody's going to be able to talk to that claimant like I can. I'm the one who has to handle the case. And I get that. At the same time, you're not going to talk to the claimant at all if you didn't call them in time and they contact another attorney. So I think, when you have a dedicated person in place, whether it's a receptionist, a paralegal, if you don't have the infrastructure necessarily to support a 24/7 intake specialist, it's important to have someone other than attorney, or at least consider someone other than attorney, making those outbound attempts, getting a hold of that person. And then once it reaches that process of reviewing that case, have the attorney get involved, because it's that initial contact that firms drop the ball on. It's not, most firms can once they're on the phone with the claimant, they can handle the questions that are needed to go through a case. That's not where firms drop the ball on. It's not, getting a hold of an attorney to get them on the phone with the client. It's the initial contact with the client, the perception to work with the firm, the ability to get them bought in their services. And that's where we're training a person to be able to do that specific role is important. And, again, you can't litigate or settle a case you don't have. So whenever I hear the argument of, oh, well, nobody can handle it as good as me, first off, I don't necessarily think that's true for all attorneys. And second off, I think that none of that really matters if you didn't have the time and the resources available to really jump on that lead immediately.
So this will be painful, this webinar and the information here, the things that we'll discuss. And I only say this just because like years ago, like, I'd hear people talking about this kind of stuff, but then I wasn't auditing our own calls, right? I wouldn't call into our own office and figure out how the phones are being answered. And by the way, if you're watching this webinar, you have not called into your own office, just ghost call, to see how your phones are being answered. Do it, right? It might surprise you, right? It might make your blood boil, but the reality is, you'll uncover it and you can fix it. Now, Denny, then the question is, okay, and actually Wendy just submitted, since we're talking about like the urgency of response and electronic leads, so does it make sense then to encourage website visitors to provide their information as opposed to just trying to get them to call into the office, even if it's during business hours? And then also, how important is it to respond to like electronic leads, like contact form submissions overnight?
Two very good questions, and I actually want to, before I forget, Mike, I want to share something that's real numbers that we ran when you were talking to me. I'm glad you brought up ghost calls. So don't let me forget Wendy's question, but I want to share something real fast. We did an intake seminar a little over a year ago in New York where we had 50 firms there, and they were firms from 1 and 2 attorney groups to 50 attorney groups that are national practices. And the one thing we did is we called into every single one of those firms, and we submitted a web inquiry to every single one of those firms. And 50 is you could say is a small subset, but I think the numbers of values across the board. And it was, you're right, even to us who kind of had a general idea what was going to happen, it was alarming, some of the results that we got, the calls that went to a firm and just nobody answered, and they went to a general voicemail. I mean, that's completely unacceptable. You got to have some way of answering that call, whether it's an outsourced service. Once your phone rings 3 or 4 times and nobody's answering, you just have to have someone answer that call. If people are leaving you a voicemail, they're calling another firm. So that's one thing. And then on the website side, I don't want to beat a dead horse here. I know I talked this already, but to give you real numbers, we had, out of 50 firms, we had 13 of them contact us in the first day. I'm not even talking about 5 minutes. 13 out of 50 contacted us in the first day. And we know what a real case is. We submitted real information that looked like a real case to the firm. And then we had 2 groups that sent us turn down decline letters, like immediately, that they weren't contacting us. So, again, as Michael said, I just want to state, even if you believe you have a real good idea what's going on in your practice, do it. It's worth the time. Call into your firm, submit a fake web inquiry, just see what happens, and really have a good understanding. And then to Wendy's question, so the website inquiries, I remember one of the questions was the website inquiries after hours, correct?
So yeah, and so one question was, I guess the first part being, how important is it to encourage them to provide their information as opposed to encouraging them to call into the office? And then also, right, how important is it to respond to those leads when they come in overnight? So like responding overnight.
Yeah, so the first part of that question, I think in today's world that we live in with all the technology and just kind of the attention spans that most people have nowadays, I really believe you have to allow a claimant to be able to fill out a web form. I think just driving them, I certainly understand the idea, and I think in a perfect world, it's best to have them call into your firm and be able to really discuss their case. But what we find a lot of times across our clients is the web inquiry forms aren't always kind of the for lack of a better term, the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. It's not just the people who don't really have a case or the ones who are just too lazy to pursue a case. Sometimes it's your more savvy consumers, because, where do people find your website? They find you off Google. They find you off searches they run. And a lot of times those are the more savvy consumers that are doing actual real research on your web pages. They're doing Google reviews. So I do believe that it's important to allow for that. I think, you don't need to plaster it at them every single page necessarily with different chat windows and website contact forms. But for someone who just wants to be able to do some research and enter their information into your site, you need to allow for that. And then when they do it, treat it as what we talked about, as it's just as important as the phone call coming into your firm. And then responding after hours, I think a very easy thing to do is either through your website provider or whatever avenue you have available, is at least have an automated response going to them to say, in the very least, to say, hey, we received your information, your case is important to us. We promise to respond to you, first thing in the morning if this is after hours, and have your business hours in there and have a standard kind of language of when you'd like to reply to them. If possible, I would have resources available that are able to, to contact that. If you have everybody going home at, 5:30 or 6 p.m., have different, hours. We find, again, on the call center side, one of the reasons it's so successful is because we're making calls out at 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m., and we're making calls on Saturday and Sundays. And that's when people are available. They're not at work. They're available to discuss their case. So if you have that capability, I would have someone, even if it's yourself, if these cases should be that important to you, when that website lead comes in, at least have an automated response. But if possible, give them a call if you can.
All right. So then, one thing that we've seen come up a lot, and these, I think all firms deal with this to an extent, but I'm wondering how much of this is reality versus just assumption, right? Where we hear about, junk leads, right? Where somebody submits a form and somebody looks at that form and says, this is a junk lead. Or when, based on the information that's submitted, they, someone could assume that there's not really a good case there. They're not really a good fit. Now, what has been your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's, from practice area to practice area, and depending on how much people are advertising, there certainly is a level of that where, leads are coming in or people are calling in that just aren't a case for anyone. I mean, nobody would rightfully spend time. Two things there, I will tell you that I think two big mistakes I see a lot of firms make is, one, again, going back to that assumption. So you can get 2 or 3 bad leads in a row. And I think for a lot of people, just like in the sales mentality, you kind of always have to treat each new call as it's the next biggest deal. And you have to train your staff and make sure your staff is accountable in the sense that they treat every lead and every phone call as the next good client. So if there are, a series of leads coming in that just aren't working out, it doesn't mean that the next one's not going to. So having that mindset is important. I also think that, this is kind of I can't go too far on this, but creating a revenue stream off referrals is another thing. I think where a lot of firms, and a lot of people don't think about referrals as the intake process, but it very well could be, because just because, you get if you're a family law firm and for whatever reason you get a personal injury call a couple times, in a month or just random, mass tort call, like, yeah, we just don't handle those cases, sorry. There's hundreds of firms out there that do, and there's very little work involved to find that right firm that's going to take that case. So just because you don't take that case, or even if it's in your same practice area and you're just more of a boutique focused, litigation firm, it doesn't mean that there's not another firm who's able to help that client, and that's a revenue stream for your firm. And if you're not familiar with kind of the standard referral model, firms are more than happy to have a split in that fee arrangement with you for originating that lead, which they should. That person called you for a reason. You're spending the marketing dollars, you're spending the money to build out your referral network. And just because it's a case that you may not take, it doesn't mean it's a case someone else might not take. So consider that as well, making sure your referral network is strong, that you're able to at least exhaust all efforts to capitalize on your marketing dollars when that call comes in for even a case that maybe you don't accept.
That's right. I mean, I agree completely. I mean, we've got a interesting referral program going. I mean, you don't have to give away a Tesla, but you can, those types of relationships are absolutely very, very important. And so I guess coming back to this, and I won't hammer this home too much, but like the so-called term junk lead, the only reason I mention this sometimes is that if someone comes in with this assumption that whatever the lead was that came in was a junk lead, and that they don't follow up with that person for 2 or 3 days, we've seen this happen, right? And then they're not able to reach them. But then they say, well, you know what, it would have never worked out to anything anyway. Or they'll assume that for whatever reason, let's say it's a so-called junk lead, it could be a qualification criteria based on budget, right? So saying that, oh, they wouldn't have been able to afford our services anyway. And would you attribute this more so to like the actual lead itself, like the actual prospective client, or the way in which that was handled more so to the intake and sales process?
100% the way it was handled through the intake process. I think, a lot of times when we're digging into data, I just use Captorra example, we're digging into data with clients, and we find that so often there's so many intakes that were created based on like an automated post from, what you guys are doing with Chris or, another source, and nobody ever has any information in there. And like, oh, well, based on what they wrote, it's just not something we decided to follow up on. And, that's making the assumption that the potential client is also a lawyer, and they know exactly what a case is, and they know exactly what to type in that makes it sound like they have a case. Some people, just have no idea what to tell you of value that might be a case. So I think if they came to your firm, they came to you for a reason, and you should exhaust all efforts in making sure that that's a case that you should or should not accept. And yeah, and I mean, it could always be that case. I've heard so many stories from firms talking to them at conferences that everyone has that one story that, oh, this person called me and my first conversation with them was just a mess, and they didn't know what was going on. They didn't have any details on their case, or just they weren't necessarily ready to pursue. And then 6 months later, it was one of their top 5 cases of the year. So it's definitely worth the effort to exhaust all effort into evaluating follow-up, connection, and making sure that you're qualifying that case. And the other thing I'll tell you there is arm your staff with that ability, because if you're not available to do that, your staff needs to have the ability and your criteria to be able to quickly evaluate whether or not that's the case or not. If you so we kind of, the evolution of the intake here, we're kind of stepping in to the next part of it, and that's the qualification procedure. Is if you have the follow-up nailed down, but you're able to get a hold of these claimants quickly and you're able to get them on the phone, but you don't have a process in place to have your staff have the ability to, as they have them on the phone, qualify whether or not, the majority of cases, that if it's going to be a case you want to accept, that's a problem. Because what ends up happening is you as the attorney may not be available. You have to let that potential client off the phone, and there's another firm that's going to talk to him who does have that process in place. So always try to arm your staff, make it as easy as possible. And I don't even mean make it as easy as possible on your staff. The potential client needs to understand that you're a firm that it's easy to work with. And if you have, 53 questions in your intake questionnaire, they're on the phone with you for an hour and a half. Yeah, I understand that may be important to you as the attorney to see how valuable that case is, how difficult it may be to litigate or settle, but that doesn't need to be gathered on the very first time you talk to that client. All they need to understand is if you're an attorney that can help them, if you're interested in helping them, and should they choose your service. That's what needs to take place on that initial contact with the potential client, and then the rest of the stuff can come later. So make it easy on your staff to be able to qualify. Make it easy on the client within the intake process to decide whether or not they want to use your service as a lawyer.
Beautiful. All right, Denny, I want to get some of these questions just because I know we've got several that were submitted, and I want to make sure that they're not omitted. So the first one, and this is, again, this comes up quite often, is what is the best way to track how potential clients found my firm, right? Because we all hear Google, right? But Google is not very helpful. Everyone's going to, if it was online, they'll say, Google. But what's the best way to actually track where that lead came from, if it was something on the internet or if it was tied to, something offline?
So there's two responses here. There's the technical response of finding, a solution that's able to tie into these things and not meaning for this to be a Captorra plug, because there's other applications out there. But if that's something that's important to you and you're advertising in different places, just that alone, I would recommend finding an application out there that has the ability to tie in to the different types of advertising you're doing, like your call rails and call tracking metrics, your social media advertising. So when that lead's coming into the system, whether it's a phone call or electronic lead, make sure it has that ability to track that. If you don't have that, or even with that, I would make sure that your staff and you are aware of how important that is to your firm. I think a lot of times, and this specifically relates to turning down a client. So you have that caller that calls in that just right away, it's going to happen. You have, I don't call it junk lead, but someone that just doesn't qualify. It's just, I chipped my tooth on a burrito and I called you before I called my dentist. Okay. That's it's something that unfortunately can't help you, but it's still important to know why they called your firm. So what I see a lot of firms do is they get that call, and understandably, I get it. You don't want to spend 30 minutes on the phone with this person. So I'll go ahead and let them know, hey, I'm sorry, this is just not a case we can help you with. Here's a local bar number, what have you, without ever asking them how they heard about the firm. Like, oh, why, what prompted you to call us? And I understand you want to let the person tell their story, but if the phone gets disconnected, if you end up turning them down, I mean, it's kind of difficult, Michael, if you call me and I say, Michael, I just can't help you. Oh, by the way, how'd you hear about me? I mean, would you feel obligated to answer that question? So I think that part of your intake process should be on the very front end. Get their name, get their number in case you get disconnected, and then get the reason why they contacted your firm. Where did you hear about us? And whether you're doing it in our software or you're doing it in Excel or what have you, always have a secondary field to that. So what we do is there's a marketing source. It's kind of the initial response of how the person heard about your firm. And they say, oh, I Googled you. Okay, great. You happen to remember what you typed in. And explain to them, say, hey, we want to know how you came to us. It's important to us to understand, why you chose to call our firm, and just let them know why it's important. So that next level is always a secondary thing. And it could be they saw your billboard, but they also hear your name, from another buddy or a friend. So it's important to know that information. So I'd always, first off, there's a technical side, find that integration if possible. There's a lot of great applications out there to track that. The second thing is to just make sure your staff is aware of how important that data is to the lifeblood of your firm, and to put that as far up front on your intake process as possible, as opposed to where I see a lot of firms do it and that's on the back end, or just not at all, to be honest. I hear a lot of firms don't even ask. So that's a critical question, critical bit of information on the front end.
So I guess the opposing argument would be, and we hear this at times, is that, they don't want to inconvenience clients, right? They don't want to make it all about them. It needs to be about the client. So asking them, like, how did you hear about us, and really digging in, you don't want it to be uncomfortable, right? Let's say someone just gets into a tractor trailer accident, someone picks up the phone and says, well, how did you hear about us, and what did you search, and what did you type, and which search engine did you use? But what would,
right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a valid point. I mean, you have to be able to, and this is where you get into the right staff at your firm and hiring the right people. You have to be able to gauge the person. So if it is a high value case, and the person's really hurting, and they're wanting to tell their story, let them tell their story. I mean, that's you don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But somewhere within your process and how you're tracking that information, your staff needs to be very much aware that this is still a critical piece of information that we need to gather. So if you have a caller that calls in and they're kind of more of the silent type, and you at the firm are directing the call, knock it out, get it out of the way. If you have someone that's rolling right into what happened and they just need to get it off their chest, let them get it off their chest. But before you let them off the call, it should be very much possible to find out that information. So, gauge the caller, understand kind of where they're at within the evaluation of a case, that process. But it's critical information, because again, it's how you run your business. It's where you should spend your money, and even if the person isn't necessarily up for telling you that information right away, it's important to gather that at some point during the intake process.
Okay, and what are some of your recommendations just as far as like optimizing legal intake? If let's say a firm's got a limited budget.
Yeah, so I've told firms this, and I'm sure my business partners love when I say this, but hey, Captorra may not be the first thing you need to do. And it's true, a application isn't always the first answer. And in fact, a lot of times it's necessarily not. A software solution doesn't just solve all of your intake problems. You have to have a process in place. And there's applications out there to help facilitate that. So to answer that question directly, I think, we touched on little aspects of it. I will tell you that one thing we haven't talked about is e-sign. And I think traditionally firms completely drop the ball on leveraging electronic signature. So whenever I say e-sign to a firm who's never used it or has used it, but it wasn't successful, it's normally because of one of two things. They look at it as an all or nothing tool. So I have to use it for every single, client I sign up, or it just doesn't work. And that's not the case. And the other thing is, we talked about making it easy for the client. So a lot of firms, and I'm sure a lot of them on the webinar, have these, big packets of 20 pages that people have to sign. And I get you need that sign. But when you have a qualified claimant on the phone, and being able to get them over an e-sign packet while you have them on the phone and have them review it with them and sign it, you want to talk about taking the competitive nature out of what you do. That's it. I mean, on the very first time you've talked to them, you've qualified them, it's kind of that sign and then investigate model. But that's the world we live in without competitiveness. So from a budget standpoint, e-sign's not expensive. There's, a bunch of options out there. It's pretty, it's not a bad price tag on it. I think that's a just out of the box solution, and then making that easy on the client to be able to leverage. And then accountability is a big one too. So I think being accountable with yourself and your staff and tracking metrics to be able to know where you need to improve upon. I always talk about the wanted conversion rate report. I think a lot of firms or people in general, when you talk about conversion rate, you're talking about, okay, I got 100 leads from this social media campaign. I signed up 20 cases. My conversion rate is 20%. Yes, that is a conversion rate, but that doesn't let you know how well your firm is at qualifying and signing up cases. So what we do is we look at the wanted conversion rate report. So we say, okay, how many of those 100 leads did you schedule a consultation with, or send out an e-sign packet on, or qualify, but they ended up telling you they found another attorney? And then out of those, so let's say that's 40, how many of those did you sign? And then that number is 20. So your wanted conversion rate is actually 50%, which sounds better than 20, but it's not good. 50% is not a good wanted conversion rate. So I think it's important for your firm and for you to understand when you're handling marketing campaigns. I think a really easy number to look at, just at a high level, how good or how poorly you might be handling intake, is that wanted conversion rate. And you need to know out of the leads you've gotten off a certain campaign or out of just your advertising in general, how many cases did you want out of that, and how many you're able to sign up? And that gives you a lot of insight on areas that you need to improve upon.
All right. And as a follow-up to this question, actually, this is very timely. Russell submits, so basically, in terms of optimizing, I know you'd mentioned being able to get them to potentially sign an e-sign right when you're on the phone with them, but do you put together like a briefing doc that basically says I'm investigating but not necessarily taking your case right now? I mean, how would you recommend approaching that?
100%. Yeah, that's a good point. It depends on practice area. A lot of times in the, we see in the single event personal injury space, they're perfectly fine sending them a retainer, because inside their retainer, it states that, we need to investigate your injuries, your medical history, things like that. But if that's not something within your field or even something you're comfortable with, that's fine. The whole point is to have the potential client obligated to retain your services, even if it's going to take a little time to investigate. And if that means sending them a scheduling confirmation paper, whatever it might be, I'm not trying to say, don't be upfront about it. Make the document say what it needs to say, but, let the client know that you're very serious about pursuing their case. And while I have you on the phone, this is how serious I am. We want to go ahead and commit to you that we're going to schedule a consultation, or we're going to, to start investigating your damages, your medical history. And if it's something they're signing, people just, they have an obligation to pursue that. I know me personally, if I'm signing something, even if I've read it and know that there's all these outs and I could go pursue other services, you know what, I signed it. I'm pretty committed to pursuing that till the end. So whatever your practice area allows you to do, whatever your culture of your firm and whatever your goals are, whatever that looks like for you, it's still very critical to leverage that type of service in today's market and allow them to be able to review something that states that you have an obligation as a firm to do X, whatever that next step is, and get a signature from them, and then pursue that case given your needs as a practice.
Right. And I think when we talk about optimization, it also, it's helping to reduce and eliminate as many friction points as possible, right? Because I've seen instances where somebody sent, like, they've got, a great client that's on the phone with them. They've got a great case. They want to move forward. And then they send them a 50-page agreement, right? Like, they'll fax it to them or they'll mail it to them. And it just, prospective clients freak out when they see those types of things, because now, first this was an emotional conversation. Now they've got to read through all this stuff, and they've got to go through all the liability and everything like that, and almost, unsells them, right? What are your recommendations
100%.
there?
Yeah, I mean, I know the last house I bought, I almost wanted to back out when we were at the closing table because of the amount of papers, and that's a house, so the same thing could be true for a case. So I would definitely streamline it as much as possible. I think this goes to the subject of, intake and sign up versus litigation and the settlement process. And I'm not talking about software. I'm not necessarily saying that intake software versus case management software. I'm just talking about the processes. And the processes and the mentality are completely different, and they should be different. Your ability to make it as easy as possible on the client within your legal needs should absolutely be your goal. Whatever the limited information that you need to gather to say, you know what, this is a case. This is a case that we want. It needs to be, honestly, a 4 or 5 page document that they can quickly review and sign, and that's it. If there's other information you need for filings at later dates, hold off. It may take a little bit of extra work on your side to follow up and get that, but it's a lot better than just freaking out the potential client and losing them because another firm sent them a 4-page document that they could fill out within 5 minutes as opposed to spending 3 hours on. With the e-sign piece, actually, we ran some numbers on that with 2 firms, one here in Atlanta, one in Vegas, and both of them had 13 kind of, we'll call them investigators. Some of them were attorneys, but people that went out and met with clients prior to utilizing. It was our solution, but also e-sign as well. And their average turnaround for sign up, I had to write it down on the side here to remember. So it was 3.2 days was the average. 3.2 days was their average kind of case acquisition time frame, and their average overhead per sign case was $167. Once we implemented the e-sign piece, their average turnaround time was 2.7 hours for a sign case. A lot of those were coming in within 5 minutes. It may take a full day, but 2.7 hours with an average overhead of $27. So $27 versus $167, under 3 hours versus almost 4 days. I mean, it's not just the math of how much easier that is and how much quickly you can sign cases. There's lost cases there to be found as well for firms that are doing that and signing those clients up.
Yeah, I mean it's just game changing. Like these small optimizations. I mean, e-sign, what is that? $20 a month? I mean, it's an absolute no
Yeah,
brainer.
yeah.
So
And it doesn't have to be the end all be all. Just when it does work, use it, and that's going to be a value to you. So absolutely.
yeah, and you can still do Telegraph from what I hear, right? You can still the service is available somewhere.
You can still fax. Yeah, you can still fax
Yeah,
documents if you
fax is
want.
still
Yeah.
available.
So
Okay.
e-sign should be your first level of solution, and if the person is uncomfortable or doesn't have the technology or the ability to do it, fine. Go to the old school method, and you should still have a procedure for following up with that. But I think e-sign should be something you could all implement tomorrow within whatever practice, and be able to leverage that at certain occasions to make it well worth the small price tag that comes with it. Absolutely.
And I don't know if you've seen any stats on this, for since we're talking about e-sign, but one of the things that we found, because we're seeing obviously a trend of more users, using mobile phones, mobile devices, and accessing the web that way, as opposed to desktop computers, right? So there's just more time spent on mobile, to the point with some e-sign, you can actually text them the agreement. They can pull it up on their phone and sign it on their phone.
Yeah, I don't know if that was meant to be a plug or not, Michael, but I appreciate it. That is absolutely what we do, and I'm sure there's other
Oh, I
systems
didn't know
out
you
there
did
that do
that.
that as well. Yeah, yeah. Texting e-sign is one of our kind of claim to fame, but there are I believe other systems out there, or if you have to kind of have a workaround to text it to them, there you can do that as well with an e-sign solution and then have a texting solution on the other side. But 100%. I mean, the stat I always like to throw out when talking about leveraging text messaging, we haven't really talked about this, both in e-sign, but also just following up with leads as well and claimants, is that, the average text message is read within 7 seconds. And the average was of the email, 50% of emails aren't even open, whether that's due to junk mail or what have you.
80.
Yeah. So is it 80? Okay. I'm probably thinking about it just from the business world, but in consumer settings, it's probably higher for all consumers. Absolutely. And then, I know for me personally, just even though you and I and everybody on this call are in the business world and we have email attached to our phone, a lot of people aren't in that setting. Your clients aren't in that setting. They don't have their personal Hotmail or Yahoo account attached to their phone. Even if they do, they don't have the mindset that all of us have, that emails are almost just as important as text messages. But even saying that, for me, when I get a text message, it's just I open it up immediately. Michael, you and I communicate via email. We communicate via text. I'm sure my responses to you via text are always a lot quicker than they are via email, and that's just kind of the way our brains work, the way our culture is today.
More emojis in the text messages than the emails.
Whatever works. I mean, whatever works. And I think it's just part of our culture. And if you as a law firm practice aren't adopting that, you're falling behind. And whether it's texting e-sign documents, whether it's having a text message follow-up as part of your lead follow-up process, it's critical. It really is. And certainly, you need to evaluate that and make that as part of your communication capability within your practice to a potential client.
Yeah, and we'll jump to the next question. But if anyone's wondering what the average open rate is on a text message, it's 100%. I don't know if anyone's never not opened a text message on their phone and just leave it for days, weeks, or months on end. But Denny, so let's say you don't have like a formalized intake staff, but you've got you've got employees. How do you motivate employees to actively pursue leads, right? Because I mean, essentially, like, what have you seen as kind of the best practice here to actually get employees to care about this and to actually follow up and actively pursue them?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it's a little bit different if you have dedicated intake staff versus legal staff that are doing it. But at the end of the day, I can't speak for every single law out there. I do know that it's pretty difficult, if not unavailable to you to commission staff to sign up cases. It's probably not in the legal industry, probably not the most healthy way to handle it. However, you do need to value your staff that are handling that intake process honestly as high as you value anyone else in your practice. You could have the best attorney in the world as your business partner, or you could be the best attorney in the world. But
many of the people on this webinar are the best attorney in the world.
Best attorney.
I'm serious.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
Like, now, when you say it in public, I did this the last time. I think we were at a conference in Virginia. Like, only a few hands went up, but every time we're on the phone, we are always speaking to the best attorney, whether it's family law, personal injury, immigration, criminal defense.
Yeah, and you should believe it, and that should be part of your nomenclature that you're a best attorney. And the thing is, even if you're a great attorney, if you don't have the case to settle or litigate, you don't have a case. It's just not there. So the staff in your firm that are handling that initial perception with the client, you need to treat them that way. You need to understand that they bring that value to the firm, or if they don't, that there needs to be changes and there needs to be accountability there. You need it if it's not a intake software, you need the ability and a process to track the activity level that your staff have. Again, we go back to sales. I mean, that's what your staff are as it relates to intake. They're your sales department. I know, Michael, you and I have this discussion all the time about activity. You know, sales, it's all about activity. It's all about phone calls. It's all about presentations. It's all about meetings. And that's no different in intake. There needs to be activity within your staff to make sure that they're on top of their follow-ups. They're on top of their scheduling and consultations, following up on the sign-up packets that are sent out. And you need a way as a partner and an admin team to track that. And if it's not taking place, there needs to be a conversation with your staff, and then your people that are good at it, treat them that way. Show them whether it's due to raises, ice cream parties, whatever it might be, smoothies. People just want to know that they're valued. And I think a lot of times with firms, a lot of successful attorneys, their success is almost their detriment. You've been successful for 10, 15 years, and I think this is true for a lot of industry professionals who have had success. You may get a little lazy. So if what you hear today maybe opens your eyes to that, you should be treating your practice and specifically your marketing and intake as you do your own personal investment. I haven't met many attorneys who don't spend a lot of time looking at the stock market, their personal investments, real estate, whatever it may be. And that same level of respect and accountability should be treated with your staff and your intake department as well. So have some of the process we talked about, be able to track that, tell them thank you when they make that 8th phone call. It's 5:30 p.m. right before they leave. Make sure there's some gratification there. And when it's not happening, then, there's different conversations need to be had or different roles. I will say that a lot of times the biggest thing I see with attorneys and paralegals who handle intake is they can't take their mindset out of their caseload. So you get that, you get the 7th call today and you have a huge caseload, which is great for the firm, but it doesn't mean that next intake isn't as important. So whether they know it or not, when they're going through the qualification process and they're talking to the firm, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is another case that we're going to have to take in. And that's, as a business partner or as a business manager or a partner in the firm, I'm sure you don't want your staff thinking that. And that's where, I'm sure you don't want thinking that, Michael, for your staff that, we can't take more work. We'll figure it out. And I'm sure that's how most firms feel, but that ends up being kind of what they're thinking about when they're on the phone. That's why it goes back to considering if you have the resource and the capability of dedicating staff that all they care about is qualifying and signing up cases for your firm, because they don't have to worry about, the actual caseload. So yeah, I mean, I be appreciative in whatever form that means to you, whether it's salary or just thank yous or whatever it may be, and make sure that you treat those people that are involved in your intake with the same level of importance and respect that you treat your attorneys. So.
Yeah. I mean, look, the reality is what gets measured gets improved, right? And people respect what you inspect. Implying that, like, when you know your numbers, you know your conversion metrics, then you can incentivize somebody who's answering the phones and saying, okay, we know this is our response rate and this is how quickly we respond. If we can get it down from 6 hours to 30 minutes, right? Then we're going to do a team outing. Or, if it's one person, you could say, you'll give them a certain bonus or whatever it is, but you can tie it to things that are very objective and easily measured. But in order to do so and be able to set those types of rewards, you have to measure them in the first place. And then I'm just experience sharing in terms of, like, when we do things like this, it's always, I track every metric. I've got these dashboards up. I mean, literally everything, like how long did it take them to open the email? It's ridiculous. Not everyone has to do that. But I will say that, like, it makes it very easy to come up with, like, what is it worth to you to improve your conversion rate by 50%, right? Like, when you can look at that and say, oh, we're getting, 1,000 leads a month, and then, we're actually signing 10 cases. And once you figure out what percentage of those were actually followed up with, what percentage of those were qualified that that the firm vetted and so on. And, like, then you can determine, like, what's falling through the cracks and simply improving those conversion metrics. I mean, it could be millions of dollars in terms of just making those improvements from existing leads or an existing inbound that you're already getting without doing any additional marketing.
100%. Those are real numbers. Like, we see that all the time. It's we have the conversation with firms and they're complaining about a campaign or a marketing group, and it's never you, by the way, Michael. It's other people. But they're complaining. What it really ends up being, though, when we dig into these numbers, they don't have the level of processes and people that we've been talking about. They're just not calling the lead. They're not making it easy on the client. They're actually losing qualified cases. And again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but your statement you just made is extremely valid, extremely, and kind of what I started the conversation off with, the answer isn't always throwing more money at marketing. I think one of the more, we talked about on a budget, least expensive things you could do is look internally in your firm and your processes and resources you have in place internally on how you're handling what happens when you open up that marketing budget, and make sure that's where it needs to be prior to looking to expand, in other areas. So I agree. And I love the team mentality. I didn't really talk about that, but you want to talk about, incentivizing your staff and making sure your staff, regardless of what walk of life they come from or what role they play in your firm, if they're touching the intake process at all, the team mentality is a good one because, whether or not that caseload is busy, they say, hey, our goal is X this month to sign up, or our conversion rate is X this month to sign up. That's what they're going to care about. Whatever that pot at the end of the rainbow looks like for your staff, it's important to them. So I like the team mentality as well.
And then the last thing I'll add to this, and then just because I know we're coming up on time, so I'll do some quick fire questions to you. But the last thing I'll add to this, and this is something that, there's been my experience just over the years, because I know everyone's like, well, how do I motivate? How do I incentivize? And you can incentivize them financially. You can get them gift cards, you can give them bonuses and raises, and those things I think are relatively transient. People will appreciate them when they get them, but at the end of the day, then, they'll reach the next level of discontent or whatever that might be, or complacency. But the one thing that I've found is even more effective than money has been recognition. People team members respond really well to recognition. When you recognize someone for improving some sort of metric within the business, or you've got, an intake staff and like a team of these people, and then you're actually celebrating, all right, who's employee of the month and things like that, and that kind of stuff. Especially when there's like that team focus and that type of culture, that we find makes a much, much greater impact. You can still do the financial incentive, but make sure that there's the recognition as well. So saying, a simple thank you, and saying it publicly in front of the whole team and recognizing that person could mean the world to them.
I couldn't agree more, man. I personally like hearing thank you and gratification from people, especially my kid who doesn't say it a lot, but yeah, what doesn't hurt your wallet as a business owner? A thank you. So, that should certainly be something that you're mindful of. I know we as business owners, a lot of people on this call, you and I, we get caught in the weeds looking at the big picture a lot. And a lot of times not even knowing it. Any interaction we have with staff sometimes ends up being more negative because that's what we're, thinking about improving. But, make sure that it's the positive reinforcement for any small thing, making that call at 5:31 p.m., going out of their way to making the client feel comfortable, listening to a recorded call that sounded great. So I agree. That should be a huge takeaway of today, is just kind of having that mindset throughout your day as an administrator or a business owner to show, positive recognition to your staff. Absolutely.
That's right. Well, I know this has been a hot one because this came up about 4 times, is really where or how early in the conversation does it make sense to discuss fees? Because I've heard guys answer the phone and say it's $5,000 for first time offender DUI. And then the person on the other line says, "Oh, too expensive," and that's it. And that's the qualification criteria. But it is important, right? Because obviously no one wants to spend an hour on the phone then to discover that that it's just not going to make sense for this person.
Yeah. So absolutely the case. And again, this kind of goes to the different practice areas where a firm may have the upfront fee on the criminal defense side or family law side versus getting the back end on a plaintiff side, but at the end of the day, we've kind of touched on this without really talking about this specifically, but, making sure the person, you're able to get the marketing information. We'll just touch on that again, because that's critical. I definitely would even if they're not a real serious client, they don't have the money that they need to pay you and you're not interested in pursuing their case, it's still important to understand why they called your firm. So definitely try to get that information from them. Allow them to tell their story. I wouldn't sit there for an hour and a half, listen to them ramble, but allow them to tell their story about what's going on. And then if you're a firm where you need that upfront fee to pursue that case, I think, an appropriate time for a lot of people would be prior to scheduling the consultation. Because that's when, time and effort and money starts coming out of your pocket. But I definitely would allow them to get through the initial, phone call of what's going on with their case. On the plaintiff side, there's really not a huge need to discuss it really at all until you get to the point of sending them the retainer. I don't really, unless they're asking, of course, don't hide behind it, but there's really no discussion needed. And it just needs to be about how you're going to help them and help them in their case. And then when the time comes that you need to get the retainer or the fee agreement from them, that's when the discussion takes place. So, the big thing is make them feel comfortable with your firm. because even if they don't have the $5,000 to pay you, you want them to go tell all their buddies that, hey, you know what, when I called those guys, they couldn't help me, but they were nice. They were open to listen to me, and they're able to tell everybody else about, your ability to at least hear them out and try to help them.
Okay. And then we had a quick question. Madeline's asking that, and we talked about following up, 7 times, 12 times, 48 times. Like, do you have what kind of timeline were you thinking for this? Is it once a day? Is it, is it a couple days? Once, I guess, does that timeline then expand, right? Do you call them every single day for 48 days straight?
Right. No, it's a good question. Yeah. And we actually have this exact workflow built out in our software, and it mirrors our best practice model. So we go to 7 attempts over the course of 45 days. Now, some firms have different, workflows they build out, which is perfectly fine, but that's kind of our out of the box. So we're 45 days, 7 attempts. And it's more aggressive on the front end. We have the first attempt immediately due. And then when you make that initial call, if you're unable to connect them, you should try them twice in the first day if possible. Now, if it comes in at 5 p.m. In the afternoon, go to the next day. But we have it 4 hours later. So if it's anytime, morning, midday, try them one more time in the afternoon. We find that's very important to try twice in the first day they've contacted you. And then we actually usually, if you've made that second attempt in the first day, you can skip a day and we'll go to the third day. And we'll end up making, I think it's 3 attempts in the first week, and then it starts spreading out. The bigger, I guess, suggestion I would make is don't make your attempts at the same time every day. So I definitely would be more aggressive on the front end, but the bigger suggestion is don't call the person at 10 a.m. every single time you try to call them. If they didn't answer the first time at 10 a.m., it probably means they have some obligation at the same time every day that they're just not going to answer the phone. Try them at lunchtime. Try them at 8:30 in the morning before they potentially get into work. Try them at 5:30 right before you leave. If possible, again, try them in the evening on the weekend. But that's my bigger suggestion. So the 7 attempt rule, I would go out to 45 days before you start considering not pursuing that lead anymore. But as an important part of that is definitely different times of the day to attempting to reach those claimants as well.
Awesome. Well, Denny, I appreciate everything. I know we got a lot of questions. We actually went through a lot through our discussion, and then any other kind of follow-ups, I'll also send to you. We'll put together a whole blog post. We'll make this webinar available on demand so everyone can check it out and share it with their friends and family. But you'd also put together something for us. So for everyone who's attended this webinar, we've got this this blueprint from Captorra on 10 steps to improve your law firm's intake. It's absolutely free. Again, you don't have to become a client of Captorra. If you're interested, you can reach out to Captorra. But Denny, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so you can contact me. The information is there. dnewberry@captorra.com. Our number that's kind of easy to remember is 855-GO-INTAKE, G-O intake, 855-GO-INTAKE. And on our website, please download the guide. Again, you can download the guide and not need Captorra. Please, by all means, the reason it's there. But I will say on our website, if you're interested in kind of seeing not only the software but some of the ideas that we talked about, and you can kind of see that in our application, the best practices for intake. Right on the website under the video link, there's quick 2-minute videos over e-sign. If you're interested, I wonder how that e-sign via text, works. There's a video on it. It's 2 minutes long. You can watch it with under 2 minutes. So at captorra.com, there's videos as well. But I do greatly appreciate everyone's time today. I know everyone's busy, and Michael, I sincerely appreciate you and your group inviting me to this. This is obviously kind of what I live. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out, even if it's not about Captorra, just intake in general.
Awesome. And Denny, I'm very grateful to have you on. Thank you for answering all these questions. This stuff is gold, to be able to apply it. I'd say if anyone really hasn't taken a serious look at their intake, you can do so right after this webinar. Just call your office or submit a form on your website and see what happens. It will change your life, right? And either you're going to just be so in love with how the phones are answered and how the forms are responded to that you're just going to go over and give everybody a pat on the back, or you're going to think about cleaning house. But don't do that. Just make sure that you focus on the training, and if there's scripts and things like that. And then Denny, I guess for another time you'll have to tell the story of when you motivated an intake staff member with a smoothie. So I am genuinely curious as to that, how that panned out. But hey, whatever works, whatever gets people excited. What I've found is it varies person by person. Some people, it's just they're interested in an Amazon gift card. Another person's interested, in dinner somewhere, and and then when all else fails, a thank you can make a huge impact. And if you're doubting how much appreciation can impact a person, just consider how many times you've heard thank you from any one of your team members, and when you do hear it, how that makes you feel.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Thank you again, Michael.
Awesome, man. Thank you.